After World War II, the center of once flourishing Kyiv was in ruins. Scorched and the streets adjacent to it literally turned into piles of broken charred bricks. Landmarks of the city were destroyed, for example, the famous Assumption Cathedral of the Pechersk Lavra. For many decades, the Soviet authorities lied, blaming the destruction of Kyiv's historic center on the Nazis. But even then, there were doubts. Now the circumstances of those tragic events have long been well known. However, people rarely talk about it. I wonder why. So today, let's talk about who really blew up the center of Kyiv, what methods were used, and what the Stalinist saboteurs managed to achieve. You'll also learn about the damage the Ukrainian capital suffered from this terrorist attack, and also about the truly Putin-style lie Soviet propaganda wove into post-war reality for decades. My name is Simen, this is the Mega Show TV channel. Let's begin. Scorched earth tactics. Since taking power, the Bolsheviks were obsessed with the idea of a major war. However, when it began, they were completely unprepared. The summer of 1941 turned into a real catastrophe for the Red Army, on a scale never before seen in world history. The entire first Soviet echelon, stationed at the western borders, was defeated. Whole armies surrendered or simply scattered into the forests. The pace of the German division's advance was 50 to 70 kilometers per day. You can only move at such a speed in one case, if you encounter no resistance at all. On July 3, 1941, Stalin, having recovered from the initial shock of the German attack, delivered his famous address to the people. "Dear brothers and sisters, I am addressing you, my friends." However, the main point of this speech was not the tearful and touching address, which had never before been characteristic of the bloody dictator, but the announcement of the scorched earth tactic. Stalin stated directly that when the Red Army retreats from certain territories, bridges and roads should be blown up, forests, warehouses, buildings and crops should be set on fire. Leave only a scorched desert for the enemy. As usual, the leader didn't think about the Soviet citizens who remained in the occupied territories. That was not his habit. And there were tens of millions of them, abandoned by the authorities and their own army to be at the mercy of the enemy. What were they guilty of, and how were they supposed to survive without bread and a roof over their heads? The famous Soviet saboteur Ilya Starinov much later called this Stalin order immoral and criminal. He noted that if it had been carried out everywhere and in full, the population in the occupied territories would have simply died out. Why am I telling you all this? It's very simple. So that you understand how the Soviet leaders thought and don't say, well, no, they couldn't have given the order to blow up the center of Kyiv along with the civilians. Of course they could. What's the fundamental difference between the buildings on Khreshchatyk and the huts in the villages near Moscow, which were mercilessly burned by the soldiers of the valiant Panfilov division, driving their inhabitants out into the bitter cold? There simply isn't one. How was Kyiv blown up? On the night of September 18th to 19th, 1941, Soviet troops finally left Kyiv. Almost immediately, German units began to enter the city. Everything happened so quickly that the valiant Chekists blew up the bridges over the Dnipro while the last retreating Red Army soldiers were still crossing them. Long before Kyiv was abandoned, the city had already been extensively mined. Power plants, water supply systems, railway and communication facilities, and the bridges over the Dnipro were being prepared for demolition. In short, everything that today is called critical infrastructure. Additionally, powerful mines and explosives were planted in the city's main administrative and some large residential buildings. For example, the current cabinet of ministers, Verkhovna Rada, presidential administration buildings, the Opera Theatre, House of Teachers, Assumption Cathedral, and Lavra were all mined. The director of St. Sophia Cathedral saved it from destruction by telling the arriving sappers that there were no basements in the building suitable for placing explosives. It was impossible to hide such work because of its enormous scale. Soon, all of Kyiv knew that the communists were planning to destroy the city before retreating. Naturally, the Germans found out about this immediately as well. The townspeople pointed out where the Soviet soldiers planted mines. Moreover, the Nazis were fortunate enough to capture a group of Soviet sappers, among whom was Lieutenant Levchenko, the commander of the special mining platoon of the main military engineering directorate. He not only handed over a detailed plan of the mining of Kyiv, but also personally took part in the demining. On September 22, the German command ordered Kyiv to be cleared of mines and called on the townspeople to report any known cases of buildings being mined. And it must be said that the Germans managed to do a lot. In particular, the Opera Theatre, the Lenin Museum, and a building in the government quarter were saved. From the Lenin Museum alone, now the teacher's house, sappers removed 3 tons of explosives. They put their find on public display, joking that the big Bolsheviks even wanted to blow up their own shrine. Still, the Germans managed to neutralize hundreds of infernal machines and remove many tons of explosives in Kyiv. However, the occupiers celebrated too soon. On September 24, a powerful explosion occurred in the Detsky Mir building, at the corner of Kreshchatyk and Prorizna Street. The German commandant's office was located here, and this was also where the city's population handed in their radios. The powerful detonation triggered explosive devices planted in neighboring buildings, particularly in the Spartak Hotel. It's interesting how differently the opponents assessed the results of the operation. For example, NKVD General Drozdov claimed that hundreds of Hitler's officers died under the rubble of the buildings. And in a special report by the NKVD of the Ukrainian SSR dated December 4, 1941, it was reported that up to 300 Germans died as a result of the explosion at the German commandant's building. Several dozen vehicles were destroyed. The Germans, however, claimed that as a result of the explosion, mostly peaceful Kyiv residents died, who had come that day to hand in their radios or were at the commandant's office for some other reason. It's likely that we'll never know the truth. After the explosion, a fire broke out, which instantly spread to the neighboring buildings. Soon, the entire densely built-up block was engulfed in flames. The rapid spread of the fire was aided by the wooden floors of the old buildings, as well as the supplies of coal, firewood and kerosene in the basements and attics. In addition, the pipes of the nearest water supply system were deliberately damaged, which made any attempts to extinguish the fire impossible. On September 25, the Germans began evacuating residents from the central streets and blew up several more buildings in an attempt to stop the spread of the fire. However, the fire continued until September 29. The destruction of ancient Kyiv occurred throughout the pre-war years as communists, claiming to fight religion, demolished the city's most notable architectural monuments. For example, in the mid-1930s, St. Michael's Golden Domed Monastery was demolished. However, Kyiv suffered even greater losses during World War II. On September 20, 1941, using a radio-controlled mine, Soviet sappers blew up the observation deck of the Upper Lavra. At the same time, the commander of the artillery of the 29th Wehrmacht Corps, Colonel Baron Hans Heinrich von Seitzlich und Golau, was killed. He became the highest-ranking officer the Germans lost during the battle for Kyiv. The incident caused a huge stir. Even Hitler found out about it. On November 1, 1941, the restless underground fighters set fire to the building of the former city council, which was located on what is now Independence Square. For this senseless act, the occupiers executed 300 hostages. And on November 3, Soviet saboteurs blew up the Assumption Cathedral of the Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra. This act was not accidental. Its goal was to kill the president of Slovakia, Josef Tiso, who was visiting Kyiv at that time. And a few hours before the explosion, he visited the Lavra, accompanied by high-ranking occupiers. If the assassination attempt had succeeded, it would have been a major blow to the reputation of the Nazis. The Nazis also contributed to the destruction of Kyiv. Before retreating from the city in November 1943, they burned down the Red Building of the university. A number of large substantial buildings on Szczelkiewicza, Volodymyrska, Lvivska, Saksahanska, Velika Zhytomyrska, and other streets. The consequences of Bolshevik sabotage for Kyiv and its residents were extremely severe. The best part of the ancient Ukrainian capital turned into charred ruins. Explosions and fire completely destroyed Kreshchatyk. On the odd-numbered side, from building number 5 to Bessarabska Square. On the even-numbered side, from today's Independence Square to Bohdan Khmelnytsky Street. The following streets were heavily damaged: Instytucka, Liutran, Proryzna, Fonduklaivska, today's Bohdan Khmelnytsky Street; Pushkinska, now Yevhen Chekalenko Street; Mykolaivska, now Architect Horodetsky Street. The newspaper Ukrainskie Slovo from October 21, 1941 described the consequences of the explosion in the center of Kyiv as follows: 5 of the best cinemas burned down, the theater for young spectators, the Kovo Theater, the radio theater, the conservatory and the music school, the central post office, the city council building, 2 of the largest department stores, 5 of the best restaurants and cafes, the circus, the city pawn shop, and 5 of the largest hotels. The Continental, Savoy, Grand Hotel and others, the Central City Railway Station, the House of Architecture and Scientists, 2 shopping arcades, a printing house, the 8th Shoe Factory, a secondary school, and more than 100 of the best stores. Many libraries, interesting documents, and valuable items were lost. For example, in the Kyiv Conservatory, a large organ and about 200 grand pianos were burned. In just a few days, Kyiv lost its best examples of modern, neo-Renaissance, classicism, and neo-Baroque architecture. When everything that could burn had finished burning, the Germans blew up the facades of the buildings that were in danger of collapsing and causing more casualties. Thus ended the great destruction of the center of Kyiv. These are only material losses, but there were also numerous human casualties. How many residents of Kyiv became victims of the explosions or burned in their apartments will probably never be known to anyone. But the number is clearly in the thousands. The fate of the fire victims, the residents of Khreshchatyk and the surrounding streets, was terrible and difficult. They were left during wartime in a city occupied by the enemy, without housing, supplies, clothing, or necessary household items. And yet, those who remained in Kyiv were the most defenseless: the elderly, mothers with small children, the disabled, and the seriously ill. They practically had no chance of evacuation. In total, about 50,000 people were left without shelter. There was another tragic consequence of the Kyiv explosions. The Germans blamed the Jews for what happened, which became the formal pretext for the final solution to the Jewish question in Kyiv. On September 29 and 30 alone, more than 34,000 Jews were executed at Babin Yar. The destruction of Kyiv impressed Hitler so much that on October 7, 1941, he signed an order marked Top Secret. Fearing large-scale mining, Hitler forbade German troops from entering Leningrad or Moscow even in the event of the surrender of these cities. Those close to the Führer recalled that he often spoke about the Kyiv explosions, sometimes with indignation, sometimes with admiration. And when the war came to Germany, he wanted the same to be done in German cities. Who was blowing things up? For many decades after the war, Soviet propaganda blamed the destruction of the center of Kyiv on the Nazis. For example, in 1953, the newspaper Evening Kyiv wrote about how the Germans were blowing up bridges across the Dnipro in 1941. Well, yes, to make it easier to cross to the left bank. Obviously, the Germans had no reason to blow up a city they had just captured. But many people believed this nonsense, and the residents of Kyiv who survived the occupation preferred to keep quiet. In 1963, the official report of the Republican KGB on the activities of Kyiv underground fighters during the war was published. It claimed that a group of partisans led by Ivan Kudrya was involved in the fires and explosions that occurred in Kyiv in the fall of 1941. The document mentioned the explosion of the German commandant's office, a movie theater, and a warehouse with radios, that is, the facilities destroyed on Khreshchatyk. The report's authors say this was how underground fighters showed the Nazis they didn't control Ukrainian soil. Yeah, they explained it well by blowing up half the city along with its residents. A lot is known about Ivan Kudrya's group. Before the war, he fought against Ukrainian nationalists in the western regions of Ukraine. And after the occupation began, Kudrya became the resident of Soviet intelligence in Kyiv. His group included, among others, the prima of the Kyiv opera, Raisa Akipnaya. In 1942, the Germans uncovered the members of the underground group. After several months of torture, all of them were executed. However, many researchers strongly doubt that Kudry and his fellow fighters had anything to do with the explosions in the center of Kyiv. They simply would not have been able to carry out such a large-scale operation. It's not like tossing a gas bottle through a window. We're talking about hundreds of kilograms of explosives planted in advance. As further evidence, there's the fact that during the September explosions, one of the safe houses of Kudryav's group, which contained valuable equipment, was blown up. In the 1960s, Kudryav's name was deliberately associated with sabotage, because that was when the official myth around him was being formed. In 1965, he was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. The mining of Kyiv was carried out by NKVD units. It is known for certain that they were the ones who blew up the bridges over the Dnipro. Marshal Bagramyan later wrote about this in his memoirs. The commander of the 4th NKVD division, Mozirin, who was appointed the last commandant of Kyiv, was personally responsible for the demolition. Overall, several NKVD sabotage groups operated in Kyiv, and Ivan Kudryav's team was just one of them. A number of modern Russian historians attribute the demolition of the center of Kyiv to the group led by State Security Lieutenant Kartashov. However, it is more likely that the city was blown up not by the Chekists, but by the military. The reason for this assumption is the widespread use of radio-controlled mines. Back in the early 1920s, a special technical bureau was established in the USSR, which, among other things, worked on the development of radio-controlled explosive devices. Their main feature was the ability to detonate remotely from dozens, even hundreds of kilometers away. In the 1930s, the USSR began mass production of radio-controlled explosive devices, and the first units armed with these infernal machines were formed. It should be noted that at that time, no one else in the world had anything like this. The cherry on top is that the creator of the radio-controlled explosive devices, the brilliant engineer Vladimir Bekhary, was repressed and executed in 1938. And finally, we can't say for sure who was responsible for the destruction of the center of the Ukrainian capital, since the documents are in Moscow and they are still classified. Restoration. The Germans promised to restore the center of Kyiv, but of course they didn't do anything. The restoration of the city center only began after the city was liberated, and even then, not right away. The authorities were primarily interested in strategic sites, bridges and industrial enterprises. In the spring of 1944, work began to clear the debris. City residents, military personnel, residents of nearby villages, as well as prisoners of war were involved in this work. The street was cleared by the end of 1944. By the fall of 1945, it was paved and trees were planted. The rebuilding of Khreshchatyk began only in 1949 and was completed by 1956. It was decided not to rebuild many things. For example, Detsky Mir, or the former city council buildings on what is now Independence Square. Overall, the post-war ensemble of Khreshchatyk has been preserved to this day. The fate of the Assumption Cathedral at Kyiv-Pechorsk-Lavra proved more complex. For many decades, it remained in ruins. It was only in the 1980s that rebuilding it was first considered. In fact, it actually began after Ukraine became independent. In 1998, by 2000, the restoration of the church's exterior was completed. The interior painting is still ongoing. Conclusion: the Second World War was a terrible time for Ukraine. Imagining the events of those years, one can only marvel at how our grandfathers and great-grandfathers endured it all. They didn't lose their minds. They remained normal people. Well, for us, this cruel historical experience should be yet another confirmation that any foreign rule brings nothing good for Ukrainians. Goodbye, everyone.